Dr. Shabir, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Pleasure to be on.
Let's talk about Cain and Abel and how they are portrayed in the Bible and the Quran. Is there a different account of Cain and Abel?
Slightly different. The main thread of the story is the same. So let's start with the Bible and then we can go to the Quran. Because often the Quran just simply picks up on the story from the Bible and does not repeat the whole story, but brings out some of the moral lessons and teachings and guidance from the story. So in the Bible, book of Genesis, chapter 1, we have here the start of the human race with Adam and Eve. So they have two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain is a farmer and Abel is a herdsman. It comes time for them to perform a sacrifice. They're going to give something back to God out of obviously the wealth and the produce that they have. So Cain comes up with some of his grain, but he doesn't bring the best of what he has. He brings the lowest quality. And Abel, on the other hand, he sincerely wants to offer a sacrifice to God, so he picks the best animal from his flock. They both perform their sacrifices. Now, God indicates his acceptance of Abel's sacrifice in a dramatic way. A fire comes down from heaven and consumes the sacrifice. Cain, on the other hand, his sacrifice doesn't seem to be accepted, and so he becomes jealous, and he decides to slay his brother. So he lures his brother into the field, and there killed him. Later on, God says to him, "Where's your brother?" And he says, "I don't know." So he lies. And then he famously utters, "Am I my brother's keeper?" As if he's so indignant towards God. So then he eventually he's confronted about what he has done. God says, the earth is crying out with the blood of your brother, and the earth now is cursed as far as you're concerned, so you're not going to be able to till it and get good crops out of it. So he has to be exiled in order to save himself, because as we know from later Deuteronomic law, the killer will be, the victim will be avenged. So the killer, his own life could be forfeited. And the way to save his own life will be to escape. But Cain now pleads with God on the grounds that wherever he goes, people will recognize him and they will kill him. So God then put a mark on Cain so that people will know that if they kill Cain, they will get 7 times the vengeance upon them, something of this nature. So that's a way of protecting Cain with this mark of Cain. So it's a very interesting story. Cain then moves east. He goes to the land of Nod, and there he takes a wife. Which is very interesting, because if we think of Adam and Eve as the first persons, and then they're having 2 children, then you wonder where he got the wife from. But nonetheless, we can ignore that part of the story. That's a wider discussion for now. Now we come to the Quranic narrative. So the Quranic narrative.
I believe he had a son named Enoch, right?
Yes, and
I think
Enoch,
his descendants passed away in Noah's time with the ark, at the time of the ark?
Yes.
Okay.
So it is related. Yeah. So now we come to the Quranic narrative, which is very brief. It's in only one place in the Quran, in the 5th chapter, around the verses 31, 32. So here, the 2 sons of Adam are mentioned, but their names are not given. In Islamic tradition, we have the Arabic equivalents of Cain and Abel as Qabil and Habil, but their names are not mentioned in the Quran. And because the names are not mentioned in the Quran, some commentators wondered if the mention of the sons of Adam could be some other sons of Adam, like not immediate sons, but way down the line, subsequent generations, especially persons from among the Israelites. Israelites. But the closer analysis about this, for example, in Al-Imam al-Razi's tafsir, concludes that despite all of this discussion, it is obvious that we're dealing here with the sons of Adam. Especially when we'll come to a later part of the story, when after killing his brother, the one wonders, what am I going to do with the corpse?
And it's clear that it's referencing that same story in the Bible.
Yes, because it means now that we're dealing with humanity in its infancy. People don't have this long experience of burial to know what to do with the corpse.
So what's interesting about the Quranic narrative?
So what's interesting is that the Quran says that when Cain offered his sacrifice, this was obviously not sincere, because then Abel is able to say to Cain, God will accept the sacrifice from whoever is really sincere in serving God. It is interesting that the Quran draws a conclusion from that story and says if anyone kills a soul, then it will be as if he kills a whole humanity. And we can see that now when we think of Abel's position, if Abel was to remain alive and to have children, then, and his children have children and so on, we can imagine a whole stretch of humanity that would be the descendants of Abel. But because he was cut short very early in terms of his life, he could not leave descendants, and so humanity is deprived of a whole slew of people. So the Quran is telling us that don't take murder lightly. You kill one person, you're killing all of that person's potential subsequent generations.
It's interesting that the Quran seems to draw lessons. It always comes up with a lesson for people to take from these stories, whereas I don't think the Bible does that.
Well, the Bible does that too. I mean, the whole Bible is obviously a book of religious teaching, but sometimes the history is, and the stories from history are told, and one wonders, like, what's the lesson from this? One might have to tease it out a little bit more, but the Quran is big on its lessons. Like, for the Quran, the main point is the lessons. If the story is told, it's only for the purpose of establishing where the lesson is going to be based on.
So, Dr. Shabir, I want to ask you, because, a lot of Christians view the story of Cain and Abel as symbolic, but it seems like the Quran sees it in a very literal, real sense. It actually happened. How do you account for that disparity?
Well, of course, from the biblical perspective as well, like, a traditional way of interpreting the Bible would take it all literally, as this is the actual history. Now, there are biblical scholars who are asking, were the first 11 chapters of Genesis really written early on, or are these stories reflective of the period of time in that they seem to depict, or are they reflective of a later period of time and then somehow backward projected to the time that it is now purported to represent. Now, as for the Quran, that too would have been the natural disposition of Muslims to say, okay, this is literal, this is the story, this is the truth, this is the history as it is. But now we are equipped with more modern tools of interpreting ancient literature and scripture. And we can see that sometimes what is meant here is not, or what is intended, or the way we should take this, is not as the literal history, but rather as stories that were known and now could be retold in a fresh way to bring out moral lessons which are congruent with the rest of the teachings of this particular scripture, in this case, the Quran. So we shouldn't take this as necessarily literal history. What is important in the Quran is not the history, but the lesson from history.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
If you enjoyed this video, click like and subscribe, and please donate to support our work at QuranSpeaks.com.